When I look at data on the 2022 US housing market, one thing is very, very clear. There is a certain set of cities in America that is in a massive housing bubble where home prices are coming down by 20, 30, even 40% over the next couple years. You can see some of them on the screen in front of you right now. If you're a potential home buyer in these cities in 2022, you should probably wait because you could be making the most catastrophic financial decision of your life by buying a home in these cities right now. But on the other hand, this same data tells me that there's a whole other set of cities in America that are not in a bubble, where it's actually still affordable to buy a home. And in fact, owning a home in this set of cities is actually cheaper than renting a home. And it's just really so important that you all understand this dynamic of home buying costs versus rental costs, because the relationship between these two is going to tell you whether it's a better idea for you to continue renting or whether you should buy, as well as if there's going to be a big housing crash. And the answer to that question completely depends on the city you live in. We're going to get things started by taking a look at Austin, Texas, a market that I believe is in the biggest housing bubble in US history, and let me show you why. The yellow line is showing the annual cost of home ownership in Austin based on your mortgage payments and property taxes. And we can see an explosion in home ownership costs over the last year due to increasing home prices, property taxes, and mortgage rates in Austin. Today, if you were to buy a home in Austin, Texas, you would have to pay $41,000 over your first year of ownership. Now, that's really expensive, right? $41,000 in a year just to own the typical home in Austin, according to data from Zillow. But folks, here's where it gets really interesting. If you were to rent a home or apartment in Austin, the average annual cost would be only $22,000. That means that right now, home buyers would be paying 90% more in Austin on ownership costs than rental rate costs. Wow, so if you live in Austin or some of the other cities that I'm about to show you, and you're making the decision of should I rent or buy, well, in a place like Austin, your costs of buying are going to be almost double your costs of renting on an ongoing basis. That's a big deal and means that more and more people in Austin are going to choose renting over buying, and it means that the local Austin housing market is in for a big crash. However, a metro like Miami, Fort Lauderdale is in the opposite situation. We can see that in Miami, the blue line, the annual cost of rent is $31,000 right now in January, which is actually higher than the annual cost of home ownership, which is $25,000. So let's get this straight, folks. In Austin, you're paying way more to be a home buyer, but in Miami, you're actually paying more to be a renter. And that's represented by these blue bars below, where we can see in Miami that it's 17% cheaper to actually be a home buyer and home owner today than it is to be a renter. And so this is where I think you can all see the point that I made in the introduction, is that there's big differences across America in terms of the relative value of buying a home versus renting. And this is going to have a big impact in different cities on, number one, how big the housing bubble is right now and how big the crash is going to be going forward. But then number two, more importantly, what makes the most financial sense for you today? And if we go back to this map, we can see that there's big differences across America in the relative value of buying versus renting in 2022, a question and decision that I know many of you are struggling with right now. Do I buy and take the plunge into the market even though it's a big housing bubble, or do I continue renting? Well, in the areas in red on this map, which are predominantly on the West Coast as well as some parts of Texas like Austin, we can see that renting is clearly better than buying from a financial perspective. In a place like Denver, the annual cost of home ownership is $36,000 compared to the annual cost of rent, which is $23,000. That means it's 60% more expensive for you to become a home buyer in Denver on an ongoing basis than a renter. Same thing in Salt Lake City. The annual cost of ownership in Salt Lake City is $34,000 compared to annual rent of $20,000, meaning it's 73% more expensive for you to become a home buyer in Salt Lake. And pretty much all of these markets in red, Boise, Spokane, Seattle, Portland, and all the way down through California, where the situation is actually worse in California in places like San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, and San Diego. It is much better for you to rent from a financial perspective than it is for you to buy a home. Meanwhile, there's other cities on this map, the metros in blue, where it's the exact opposite. We talked about Miami a second ago being a better place to actually buy than to rent. These other metros in blue, which I'm going to talk about in a second, offer the same value for home ownership. Now, before getting more into those cities in blue, the places where it's actually better for you to buy than it is for rent, I want to just zoom out for a second and talk about why this data is so important for you to understand. This data from Zillow, which tracks home values and rents, and the adjustments that I included for mortgage rates and the cost of property taxes. You need to understand this because number one, if you're doing your budgeting for 2022 and trying to decide whether you should extend your lease or buy a house, you need to understand how these things balance out. If it's 50 to 100% more expensive for you to get a mortgage and pay property taxes and insurance, then maybe you should rent for another year and wait for the housing market to cool off, particularly on the western half of America. But then on the other hand, say you do your budget. You figure out what your lease renewal would cost and compare that to how much your mortgage payments and property taxes and insurance would be for a home, and you see that all of a sudden it would be cheaper for you to buy a home based on this comparison and this budgeting, well then maybe you should go ahead and do that, because even though it's a big housing bubble, even though we're going to see home value declines, if it's cheaper for you to buy on an ongoing basis, that might be what's most important for you. We can see in a market like Oklahoma City here in blue, it's 12% cheaper for you to buy a home locally than it is for you to rent a home or apartment. Similar situation in Tulsa, it's 17% cheaper for you to buy a home on an ongoing basis in terms of your costs and expenses. And we can see a lot of places in the Deep South are this way. Memphis, Tennessee, it's 22% cheaper. Jackson, Mississippi, it's 29% cheaper. Jackson, more than any other metro, is the best place to buy compared to rent. And just real quick, guys, if you are appreciating this data and you want to see more of it going forward in this video and in future videos, just make sure to smash that like button. Birmingham, Alabama is a similar situation, 12% cheaper to buy. If we head into a place like Augusta, Georgia, or Columbia, South Carolina, it's 20% cheaper to buy. Same situation in Greensboro, North Carolina, in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Much of the South and the Deep South is still very affordable for home buyers, even though we're in a housing bubble. And this is the nuance you need to understand as a home buyer or investor in today's housing market, that yes, we're in a national bubble, but when you zoom in and look at the data in different cities, it's very clear that certain markets are still affordable and still present value for home ownership. Meanwhile, while other ones, basically everywhere in red on this map, the western half of America, presents terrible value for home buyers, and it makes a lot more sense to rent and wait out the housing bubble and the housing crash in these places in red. Now, one additional point that I need to conclude with here is very important for you all to understand, and that goes beyond the budgetary implications here of comparing ownership costs versus rental costs. It goes beyond that and talks more about the housing crash implications. Because this data point, the relationship of ownership costs and renter costs, actually is a pretty good predictor of the markets that are going to have the biggest housing crash. Historically, in US housing market history, the more that home prices and ownership costs go up above underlying rental rates in a market, the more likely it is that that market is going to have a big crash. Let's just think about the incentives. All of a sudden, the incentives in a place like Austin or Salt Lake City or Boise, Idaho, or LA or San Francisco skew towards renting, right? So many people just get priced out of the housing market that they say, I'm going to rent. And I'm going to save money by renting compared to owning. Moreover, real estate investors start to not like those markets as well, because the rental yields, how much rent they can get compared to their home purchase cost and their mortgage cost, if they got a mortgage, goes down. So investors don't like these markets either. And so that's why, as I've said many times on this channel, the areas in red on the western half of the US are going to crash hard. That crash is going to start very, very soon as mortgage rates continue to go up. Higher mortgage rates are going to mess up these markets where ownership costs have already ballooned out of control above rental costs. Conversely, if it is still cheaper to own than it is to rent, then that provides an incentive for people to still buy homes, even in a bubble. And it likely means that as the national housing crash unfolds, that these markets will have more buyers who are ready and willing to step up to the plate and support the market, because when they do their ongoing cost budget, it makes sense for them to do so. Now, before signing off, I think a lot of you are probably interested in how you can get this data for yourself and understand the buy versus rent proposition in your market. And there's a really easy way to do that. Hit the join button below and become a channel member to the ReVenture Consulting YouTube channel. By becoming a channel member, you get access to a lot more data than you actually see here in the videos. To my channel members, I give exclusive newsletters, videos, and interactive graphs. You're actually going to have access to these interactive graphs if you become a channel member. Hit the join button below. In case you don't see the join button, there's a link in the description where you can sign up to become a channel member. Best practice is to sign up on a computer. Sometimes people have issues when they're accessing the link from their phone. So go to a computer, hit the join button below, or click the link in the description. The cost is $5 a month, and you're going to get access to a lot of this data, as well as the latest edition of the ReVenture Consulting newsletter, which I just dropped today, a 40+ page newsletter on the US housing market, only available to my channel members. Just dropped a couple hours ago. So if you want access to that, hit the join button and also leave a comment below. I'm curious what you guys are seeing. Does this data align with what you're seeing in the market? How much you're paying for rent compared to maybe how much your budget is for buying a house when you do those numbers? Let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your insight. All right, everyone, until next time, this is Nick from ReVenture Consulting signing off.